for a 0.5 patch, this is very massive. Can you talk about some of the highlights that you're looking forward to most for players to experience in this patch?
So yeah, we definitely packed a lot in here, trying to make sure we can get content out to different buckets of players, right? Who may be interested in different types of things, and we think there's something here for everybody. Obviously, Dawn of the Infinite, new mega dungeon. It's going to be some really cool instance content for smaller groups looking for a more raid-like experience, a more challenging experience to get to partake in. Outside of instance content, we have Time Rifts, which is a new open world activity that groups of players will get to engage with every hour at Tierhold Reservoir. Players will come together to fight back the forces of alternate potential bad timelines that have these time entities taking the form of past antagonists in World of Warcraft, and also some new sort of what if scenarios that haven't even potentially happened yet, like a version of Azeroth where we have the Alliance and the Horde never having stopped fighting. They've stripped the planet of all resources. You have King Varian Rin with a chainsaw for a hand, right? Like just really interesting things like that players get to experience in these events. And essentially you'll come together as a group, fight back these time entities, and ultimately battle a time entity that takes the form of the leader of these groups. So for example, with the Scourge, what if the Scourge won, right? You'll fight against a time entity that takes the form of the Lich King and battle against him. And so I think there's some really cool stuff there for all types of players to enjoy, including solo players. We have Eon's Fringe, which is new daily content. Again, goes along with the theme of time, ties into some of the things occurring in Dawn of the Infinite, the mega dungeon. Nosdormu sees that his time, right, is approaching, and he feels like this is creating a disturbance that's causing time to go awry. And because of that disturbance, you're helping in these sort of repeatable quests battle back against these bad timeline events that shouldn't be occurring. We have something for collectors as well, WHELP DAYCARE. Players are going to get to invest some time into taking care of little whelps that they can eventually earn as non-battle companion pets, which is pretty cool, along with some other rewards. Dragon races, players will be able to take across the skies of Kalimdor in these races and earn new transmogs and dragon customization. So yeah, there's a lot here. There's even more. Morgan, maybe there's some stuff you'd like to talk about. I feel like you certainly hit the nail right on the head, Greg, that there's a lot in this content update, no doubt.
I think the two things I'm most excited for, well, let's go with three. One is the mega dungeon. The second is Augmentation Evoker, which is our new spec. And the third is all the massive improvements we've done for returning players who maybe haven't played at all during Dragonflight. And there's been a tremendous amount of work that the team did to kind of make that on-ramp quite a bit smoother for someone who hasn't played for Dragonflight. Maybe they want to come back, check out the new mega dungeon with their friends, and we just want to make sure that that's a great experience for them.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but would you say this is the largest 0.5 patch you guys have ever pushed? Because you guys have done a lot. I know there's been a lot of expansions, but if there's so much in a 0.5 patch, usually I would expect this with 10.2, right? Like this much content.
I don't know. Ultimately, it just really speaks to our philosophy of wanting to provide players with content at a satisfying and responsible rate. We just came out with Emberthal and Ebyssian. There's a whole new zone. We kind of expanded and updated the outdoor world. And this was an opportunity for us to provide more content for those outdoor world players, as well as those players who really enjoy dungeon content. So yeah, I'm not sure in terms of the amount of stuff. I'm sure I could ask a producer who would probably be able to answer that for me. But ultimately, yeah, we're just really excited to get amazing, fun new content into the players' hands.
Now, normally when you do a big update like this, there's a couple things you touch on. Some players, unfortunately, you can't please everybody, right? Get left out. But this content, you seem to cover the gamut of everything. You got something for the battle pup player, something for the hardcore, outdoor world PvE players, something for the pet players, something for the role-playing players, something for the dragon riding players. I can go on and on. You seem to have touched every player base you've had just a little bit in this patch. Was that difficult?
I mean, certainly it's something that we're happy whenever we can accomplish something like that. One of the things, right, that we ultimately try to do when we think about new content is trying to do this, as much as we can, because we know that our player base is diverse, and we want to try to accommodate, the different play styles that our players have. So, certainly there are challenges always when trying to, I guess, please everybody, as you put it. But I think that part of the way we're able to sort of handle that elegantly is sort of having these sorts of buckets of content, right, that can be tailored more towards specific types of players who are looking for said content, right? Versus trying to have one giant thing that's tailored to everyone, right? That's a little bit more difficult to accomplish. And so by having different pieces, right, of the cake, as it were, right, it makes it easier to accomplish that. And that's what we're trying to do here.
And especially with our, content cadence that we've been trying to stick to, we always want to make sure that we're constantly looking at, okay, cool. When was the last time we added a new piece of content over here for this player type versus another player type? So even if there isn't something in this patch that is, checking all the boxes for you, there's another patch right around the corner that hopefully is something that you're excited about. Like with the mega dungeon, there's a lot of really fun story. Stephen has mentioned before, this is really an opportunity to explore almost like the main story plot of Dragonflight. We're going to learn about Eridikron, who we've known he's quite the player in this expansion. So exploring that story is really awesome. But if you're someone who isn't into that more challenging experience, maybe, we're going to actually be adding the mega dungeon as a heroic dungeon. So it'll be a queuable experience in 10.1.7, which is right down the road. So that's always something that we're looking forward to, is just hitting all the beats, because one of the most amazing parts of World of Warcraft is that there's something for everyone. You can enjoy just a small slice of the game, and there's still a tremendous amount of content for you to play. So that's always something that we're trying to keep in mind when we kind of plan out our content slate.
Steven, this isn't your first mega dungeon you've introduced to the World of Warcraft, but take us kind of to the mindset of what you decide to do a mega dungeon over a raid, and like how you guys develop that internally, and why you inevitably make the decision to make it a mega dungeon instead of a raid.
I think this does speak in part to what we were just kind of referencing, which is when we look at a dungeon and a dungeon experience, right? Our dungeons generally are a 30-minute experience. You can maybe play on your lunch break, right? Whereas our raids are sort of this more elaborate, longer form content that requires a lot more coordination, a lot more time investment. And so, one of the things that we've had access to for higher end players that are looking for dungeon content, right, for many years now is Mythic Plus. And we think Mythic Plus is awesome, right? Our players like Mythic Plus. We like it too. But there are players who have asked us, hey, is there a way that we could get more challenging dungeon content that isn't on a timer, right? That maybe is challenging in a different way. That's more like progression-based content, like a raid. And so in making the decision to have Dawn of the Infinite be a mega dungeon instead of another raid, it allows us to offer a different type of content experience for players that it is sort of unique when even compared to a raid, right? It's a smaller party size, which means maybe it's easier to handle the logistics, right, of getting a group together of just some of your friends and going in, but still getting to experience the epic sort of storytelling and the different types of coordination that you might expect in a raid, still getting access to that type of thing in the dungeon experience. And that's one of the reasons why we look at the mega dungeon format for something like Dawn of the Infinite. I think beyond just that part of it, right, we feel like just having that type of longer form experience lends itself well to helping, I guess, communicate some of the story beats that Morgan was touching on, and being able to explore that in a longer form, smaller group setting just makes a lot of sense for us, and we're really excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, like, how do you explain 15 years of Warcraft history to a player that's maybe coming into Dragonflight for the first time? I'm assuming that the mega dungeon kind of helps with that, explain what's going on with the dragon aspects at least.
Yeah, I think certainly, right? In particular with Dawn of the Infinite, you're going to have Chromie and Nozdormu with you for a lot of your time in there, and they'll be sort of walking you through, right, what you're seeing. There's this really cool moment where you go back to ancient Dragonblight before it was called Dragonblight, and you see the moment that Galakrond, this very important lore character, falls, and you sort of you're getting there right after he's been defeated, and you see the effects of his necrotic, disgusting ooze all over the place, causing bad things to happen. And Chromie mentions, oh wow, that's Galakrond. He was the biggest proto-dragon ever, and kind of explains a little bit, right, about what you're seeing. And that certainly helps, explain what you're kind of touching on, Greg, which is getting players maybe invested that didn't know who Galakrond was before, right? We have plenty of players who might be aware of that lore, but a lot of our players might not. And so it's important for us to always factor that in when we're telling these stories. And I think that Dawn of the Infinite gives us a way to communicate a piece of lore through the game that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet, which is this ancient proto-dragon sort of story, and tie that into the current antagonists, the incarnates, right, who are also dragons. and also tied into the Bronze Dragonflight story, right? We have this very dragon-centric thing going on here that really helps tie the pieces of what we've been looking at together.
So Dragonflight's not just a clever name; it actually has to do with yeah.
Exactly. It's such a clever name for multiple reasons, really. I mean, something that I'm actually really excited about with Dawn of the Infinite and also Fractures in Time is, Stephen was just saying, these incarnates in particular are such a big part of our story going in, leading into Dragonflight as well as all throughout. We met Razagath initially, and she was defeated in Vault of the Incarnates, but then set free her clutchmates with Viranoth, Farak, and Iridikron. Farak, we've very much know what he's been up to. Like, he's been down, kind of getting all Shadow Flame infused. Iridikron we're starting to see in the Mega Dungeon, but Viranoth is also a character that we haven't seen as much from yet, but that's definitely a character we want to explore more with the Fractures in Time update. And that hasn't, I don't believe, been something that players have seen yet, but there's definitely some cool stuff coming with her as well.
Now, the major update is the Warlock class. Now, any race can be a Warlock. How does that affect like the in-game raiding or the in-game dungeon or PvP when you have race abilities coupled with a class that didn't used to have those race abilities?
Ultimately, we don't think that will cause too much of a balance issue. There's also a lot of new allied races that are going to be running around there. Ultimately, we're just looking to allow players to create a character and express themselves in the way that they feel best suits how they want to play the game. That customization and self-expression is something that has been a goal of ours for a long time, and this is just a continuation of that, right? With Dragonflight, we added a ton of new customization options for all the characters. I think Dracthyr have more customization options than like grains of sand on the planet, which I'm not going to verify that myself, but someone said it, and I'm like, fine, I'll repeat that because I bet no one will verify me. That really just speaks to this idea of, your identity and really creating a character that you identify with. And not just with Warlock class expansion, but there's other customization options as well. Like Worgen are getting some new customization options. Allied races are getting much easier to unlock with this update, so that if there was an allied race that you really identified with but felt like, ooh, that's a quite a bit of work to unlock that character.
It really is. I mean, I was one quest away from getting the Mecha Gnome unlock, and I haven't been able to seal it. But yeah, it is a lot of work.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that stuff has been kind of loosened up quite a bit. So really, that just speaks to that overarching goal of customization and, having a character you can identify with.
Now, you said we're going to get more customization jobs. Are we finally getting tails on Worgen? Because I know that's a feature everyone's been asking for since they were launched in Cataclysm. I
think it's new for colors, but we have definitely heard that feedback about, can we have tails, please?
So I want to talk about like your KALIMDOR Cup event. Like you say dragon riding is coming to KALIMDOR, but like it's only, can you kind of elaborate that for people who are maybe misconstruing that? Like I did, like, oh, Dragonflight's coming to the core game. It's not. It's a specific event in specific locations, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I think this is right. This is kind of like a foray, right, into the possibility.
A test flight, no pun intended, right?
Sure. It's something where we can kind of get players doing dragon riding in the old world without opening up completely, right? This is something where we're sort of stepping our foot into those waters with these races. And while we don't have any plans to announce anything further at this time, it's the kind of thing where we are stepping into the ocean, right? We're stepping our feet into the water.
Yeah, Morgan, elaborate on this just a little bit. Is dragon riding was received so well in the expansion, and I think there's a misconception of people thinking it's just a flip you switch and like everything works in Azeroth, like you don't need to do any backing. Can you kind of explain why it's not just an easy flip up switch, have dragon riding all over the continents instantaneously?
A good bit of it too is just design, right? Like we designed the Dragon Isles with dragon riding in mind, from the very onset of the creation of this continent, of this space. We knew dragon riding was going to be a part of it. So ultimately, there's just work that may need to be done with mounts, with the old world. There's also just like the speed at which we're flying around. Like, is that the right speed? We've really tuned that to feel good in Dragon Isles, but what's that going to feel like when you take it to other continents? So there's a lot of kind of design work that's being done under the hood there, as well as, ultimately, when we released dragon riding, it was initially just a Dragonflight feature, right? And we know and usually try to take a lot of caution when it comes to creating things like that and making them evergreen and letting them be used throughout the world, because we know that that's not something that you can take away, right? There's only kind of one direction that you can move with that. So we like to do those types of changes in a very metered and measured way. Not too dissimilar with things that you're seeing with faction differences, right? With Dragonflight, we allowed cross-faction instances, and then from there we allowed cross-faction guilds. And with this update, actually something that is actually really cool, I think, is cross-faction trading will be enabled, right? So if you're raiding with people, you'll be able to trade more easily or at all. And be able to, like, you know, pass your consumables or some items across one another. So really it's just one of those features that we know we want to be measured as we kind of create a more evergreen environment for it.
Now, you do have a new Invoker class specialization. It's DPS, but I'm just curious, how do you guys decide on this new specialization when a class is coming out? Because for me, I think, oh, tank Black Dragonflight, right? It's a lock, right? But then it comes out with DPS. So kind of take us in the meeting room how you guys decide to do DPS over a tank spec, and if that's because you don't want to mess with the economy of the game too much, or the balance between raiding and instancing or PvP.
That was definitely a hot topic amongst our group, but ultimately we really, you know, the goal of Dracthyr was to create a range spec, right? We hadn't had, I think we have actually removed more range specs than we've added through the course of adding new classes. So it was something that we're like, look, we have a lot of space to explore here. Let's keep Dracthyr at range. You know, also there's just the considerations of, like, they got big old wings. They're kind of flying around and flapping around. The melee have given us a lot of feedback that, you know, sometimes it can be hard, a challenge to dodge things with all the stuff going on in melee. So let's keep them at range. We think that's been really successful so far. And then also ultimately, like, we knew we wanted this to be a damage dealing role very early on when we were talking to some of our engineers. One of the things that was discussed was like, hey, what if you only can have one of these in like a queued instance? And it was like, well, ultimately, yes, we could do that, but we should really be designing them such that multiple of them would work well together, right? Let's just make sure that we design it in such that if 2 Augmentation Evokers show up in your dungeon group, you're like, oh, okay, cool, this works out fine, right? That would be a better experience than trying to, like, come up with these rules behind the scenes to make sure that that can't be possible. And then also when it came to, you know, adding this spec, you know, one of the major goals that we wanted to fulfill was this idea that, you know, right now, if you're a player who wants to help your friends, you want to support your buddies, the main place players we have found go who feel that way is they roll healers, right? And ultimately, I would argue healing, especially if you're doing something like saying healing in Dawn of the Infinite, right? The mega dungeon, it can be pretty hard, right? It can be pretty stressful. People's lives are in your hands. And we wanted to create, you know, a role that could fulfill that same fantasy of those people who want to help out without the stress of a healer. The way I've been phrasing it is like, you know, those people who just want to play Mercy like in Overwatch and follow their buddy with the damage amp beam because their buddy has really good aim. It's like, yeah, I don't have good aim, but you have great aim, right? Like, you're really good at DPS, I'm less good at DPS. Can I make you better? You know, we think that there's a lot of people who will enjoy that play style. And when we're talking about adding a new spec, you know, we have a ton of specs. Let's not add something that we've already got covered in terms of gameplay and mechanics. Let's explore a new space, and this was a space that we hadn't gone to before, so it felt like a great opportunity.
So Stephen, speaking of, you're an encounters designer, so like when Warcraft drops a new specialization or even a new class, like how does that affect your workflow when you're making these raids and these dungeons?
Yeah, super interesting question. You know, honestly, I think in a lot of ways we try to design our encounters to sort of encompass combat roles, less about like literally, you know, specific classes, right, or specific specs, and more about like, you know, what are some general buckets of combat abilities that will feel good in this moment, right? And so certainly there are absolutely moments to shine for specific classes or specs when we're designing encounters, but ultimately we always want to try to ensure that our encounters are supporting a wide, you know, variety of potential compositions. Now, obviously, as you start getting into the, you know, the super high end, like mythic raid, you know, cutting edge tier, some of these things become a bit more, I guess, important in terms of like specific compositions. But ultimately, our goal is to create, experiences that that allow for the accessible nature of bringing different different classes and specs to your group, and being able to see success, right? And Augmentation Evoker might find specific sequences during Dawn of the Infinite where they really shine, right? But that doesn't mean that you need them, right? It doesn't mean that doesn't mean that you can't finish an encounter without having them. But they might feel particularly special during a specific sequence if it lines up with giving the party a ton of buffs right at the right moment or something, right? So it's about creating those sort of flavor moments, I would say, that certainly have an impact, but are not a lock and key. We certainly don't want lock and key situations when it comes to class and spec, and particularly in a dungeon context like Dawn of the Infinite.
Yeah, I think the only time we really assume that you have something is like a mythic raid, right? That's one of the reasons that we've kept mythic raiding at 20 players, is that we can assume, okay, you're gonna have a priest, so maybe we have a fun mind control mechanic or something like that. But outside of that, yeah, we don't like to design things assuming that you have a specific class or spec.
Now Warcraft is well over 15 years old. I want to know what are some of the challenges. We've come a long way from like raiding of just don't stand in the fire, right? Like as an encounter designer, like you're still limited to the technology because you can't do WoW 2. So like what are some of the challenges for you personally when you have to work in this little confined box of like the 15-year-old code that granted you've updated tremendously, but it's still, an older game?
I think honestly, it's a lot of fun sort of coming up with new, unique ways to challenge players, in a variety of different environments and situations. I think that in a lot of ways, we certainly, I feel like, have evolved, right? The way that we are able to challenge players, and we absolutely have, right, had technological advancements on our end that have allowed us to expand the ways in which we design mechanics and implement mechanics. I think first and foremost, really what we're trying to do when we sit down and create an encounter is just think about, what is the core fantasy of what this boss or creature does, and how would they challenge a group of adventurers if they really existed? What is like the one thing we want players to sort of walk away from when they see this encounter? And then we layer on mechanics to help enhance that challenge, right? And things have obviously evolved from the days of the original game, where a boss might have one or two mechanics. And so I think you're touching on something that I think is important to mention, which is the idea of complexity and difficulty. And I think one of the ways that we try to navigate that in the modern game is to create different buckets of experiences for different types of players who are looking for different levels of that type of complexity, right? This is why we've gone on to have multiple different difficulty modes, right? This is why we have the concept of Dawn of the Infinite's launching at a specific difficulty mode, and then, as Morgan mentioned, very soon after following it with heroic and looking for group. I think in particular, right, with Dawn of the Infinite, we are targeting a more challenging, more coordination type experience, but we still want to design mechanics that allow players to feel like they can make progress, even if they aren't like a cutting edge player. In fact, Dawn of the Infinite, right, on its default, which is what we've been calling hard mode in the past, if you're a heroic raider or someone who does mythic 15s, right, I think you'll feel right at home with the level of challenge that you find. But that doesn't mean, right, if you're a lower geared player or what have you, right, we want to be able to create sort of a progression curve with our encounters that makes you excited and makes you feel like, hey, we can go in there and kill the first couple of bosses and get some loot, even if we're under geared, right? Like maybe we can persevere, especially when you don't have a timer in play, right? This is a more free-form experience. This is, again, part of the reason why we're doing this with Dawn of the Infinite. So I think ultimately it comes down to making sure that we're designing a wide variety of mechanics that challenge different skill sets, different thought processes, and then layering that in across a dungeon or a raid so that you have a wide variety of experiences and challenges by the end of it.
With the expansion of upgradable gear drops for Time Walk raids, and with the patches focuses on the quirks of the time in the Warcraft universe, is your team considering expanding the number of time walking events that have raids?
Yeah, I mean, we have definitely, over time added time walking. As we introduce a new time walking thing, we might introduce a raid otherwise. I think we're up on deck for like a Miss Pandaria time walking raid if we were to add another one. It's definitely something that we consider. Ultimately, since like we were talking about earlier, like what type of content, what type of player, do we feel like needs some new and exciting things? We think time walking is and specifically, like leveraging a lot of these, this awesome legacy content is really valuable. We were running that amazing time walking event leading into the Emberthal and Ebyssian update. We've really been leaning into revisiting legacy content with our Mythic Plus seasons. So we definitely think there's opportunity there as well to kind of revisit what does a time walking raid or a legacy raid look like. Ultimately, right now our time walking raids are tuned around normal difficulty, but from what we've found, normal raid gear, one is relevant, but it's relevant for a specific amount of time, and then as the patch moves on, it's less exciting. So depending on when these raids pop up in a patch's life cycle, really alters how valuable they might be. So that's definitely something that we have discussed and would likely want to revisit before we just continue to add ones that like we have in the past.
How was the experience for the team regarding player feedback for the now removed Alexstrasza questline for 1.15?
That's a great question. So that was something that actually not only did the community notice that rather quickly, but we also identified it internally when we were doing our own play tests. So the Timelines and Aeon Fringe quest lines are an opportunity for us to explore, the very rich Warcraft history. And the event with Alexstrasza, we felt, specifically the players' interactions with that period in history didn't sit right with the players, and specifically their role in that event, right? The player wants to feel like a hero. They always want to feel like they're the savior of the story, and we didn't feel like, we were hitting the mark with that. So we took another pass at that questline in particular, and really went at it with that idea of making sure the player feels like a hero and is taking actions that are aligned with that idea. So, we want to make sure that we're building content that's consistent with our values, and we want to make sure that we're listening to player feedback and building a world that's welcoming for all players.